The judge's gavel slammed down like a gunshot, silencing the packed saloon-turned-courtroom. Dust hung in the air, thick with tension. She stood alone at the center, wrists bound, chin high, her eyes defiant despite the bruise blooming on her cheek. "She murdered him in cold blood," the sheriff snarled, pointing at her like she was a rabid dog. The townsfolk watched like vultures, whispering tales they'd made up before facts were ever known. No lawyer, no family, no mercy, just the gallows waiting at dawn. And then the saloon doors burst open with a thunderous crash. Every head turned. He stepped in slow, boots thudding against the floor, spurs screaming with each step. The infamous Colt McCade, bounty, hunter, gunslinger, killer of men whose names were once too feared to be spoken aloud. The sheriff reached for his iron. "You got business here, McCade?" McCade's eyes locked on her, his jaw tight, his voice calm and clear. "She's my wife." Gasps rippled through the room like wildfire. That's when everything changed. "Before we jump back in, introduce yourself and where you're tuning in from, and make sure you're subscribed." Dry Creek wasn't a place where secrets stayed buried. It was a town where the wind seemed to whisper every sin, and where the dust that settled on your boots carried stories older than the graveyard. One main street, two saloons, a church with a lopsided steeple, and a gallows that saw more action than the schoolhouse ever did. She came there quiet, no fanfare, no family, just a woman alone, riding side saddle on a borrowed horse, her eyes hidden beneath the brim of a brown fraying hat. The townsfolk gave her one look, then turned their heads like they'd seen a ghost. A few whispered her name. The braver ones muttered it louder. Josie Miles. Some said she was cursed, others said she was a witch, but most agreed on one thing. Wherever she went, death followed. She rented a room above the old blacksmith shop, paid in coin with calloused fingers, and asked for nothing. She didn't speak much, not because she was rude, but because she couldn't. Josie was born without a voice, a silent scream trapped in a world too loud to notice. A scar ran from her jaw to her collarbone, angry and jagged. The mark of a fire long past, or maybe a blade. No one knew for sure. The story changed every time it left someone's lips. "She don't flinch at gunshots," a boy once whispered to his mother. "She don't smile neither," the mother had replied. Josie had no friends. Not really. The schoolteacher tried, once offering her a leftover muffin from the Sunday bake. Josie took it, nodded, then walked off before another word could be spoken. Some mistook her silence for pride. Others saw it for what it was, pain buried deep beneath years of surviving. Most days she swept the saloon porch or stitched worn saddlebags for traveling cowboys. Her hands were good with a needle, steady even. But no one looked her in the eye when they paid her. And when the sun dipped behind the canyon walls, Josie always walked alone. Past the shuttered windows, past the men who drank too much and the women who laughed too loud. She walked with a limp that grew worse in the cold, a memory of a fall, or maybe of being thrown. No one dared ask, but they talked. Oh, how they talked. "She's the one who buried her husband with her own hands," they'd say. "He died with a bullet between the eyes," another added. Some say she pulled the trigger. Rumors traveled fast in Dry Creek, and none were kind. But Josie never defended herself, never tried to correct the tales. Maybe because no one would have listened, or maybe because some parts of those stories were true, and that's what made her dangerous. Before we dive any deeper into the story, just a quick note. I'm Thomas, the voice behind this narration. If you enjoy how it sounds, let me know in the comments so we can keep the same voice in future videos. Now, let's get back to Josie. One day, she was sweeping the porch of the Blue Cactus Saloon when a stagecoach rolled in from the south. It was late, the horses dust-covered and near collapsed from the heat. A stranger stepped down, a man in a fine coat, polished boots, and eyes too sharp to belong here. He asked for whiskey. Then after one look at Josie, he asked her name. She just stared. "She don't talk," the bartender muttered. The stranger didn't blink. "That's so?" He tipped his hat at her anyway, like a gentleman, and sipped his drink slow. Most folks would have turned away by then. But not him. He watched her like a man watches the horizon, searching for something he'd lost. Josie felt the stare, felt something stir in her that she hadn't felt in years. But it wasn't love. Not yet. It was recognition. Like he saw her pain and didn't flinch. Over the weeks that followed, the man came back, sometimes alone, sometimes with dust on his coat and blood on his knuckles. He never gave a name, and Josie never asked, but she noticed things. How his left hand always hovered near the butt of his pistol, how he never sat with his back to the door, how the sheriff stiffened when he entered the room. He was no drifter, no gambler. He was dangerous, like her, and that was why she didn't run. Because for the first time since she buried her husband beneath the cottonwoods 5 years ago, someone wasn't afraid of her silence, or her scar, or her past. He was made of the same shadows. But still, she said nothing. Because silence had kept her alive this long, and words were for people who had something left to lose. The stranger kept returning, always alone, always after sundown. He never stayed long, just long enough to sip whiskey slow and rest his boots. But each time, his eyes found Josie, and each time she felt the wind change. Dry Creek didn't get many new faces, and the ones it did usually left with bruises, or worse. But this man settled in like he belonged. Like the creaky floorboards and flickering lantern light, knew his name even if no one else did. Still, no one dared ask it. Josie began to notice small things. How he'd pull out her chair before she sat. How he left half his cornbread untouched if she hadn't eaten. How he nodded when their eyes met, as if he could hear every word she never spoke. Once, she found herself lingering longer on the porch, after dark, sweeping the same corner twice, hoping to see that familiar silhouette ride in through the dusk. One night, as she locked up, she turned and found him leaning against the wall just beyond the light's edge. She froze. Her hand hovered near her pocket knife. He raised his hands. Didn't mean to startle you. His voice was rough, like boots dragging through gravel. Not cruel, just lived in. She didn't move, just waited. He stepped forward, slow. The moonlight caught his face, scarred at the brow, jaw squared, eyes the color of wet earth after a storm. "You don't talk," he said. It wasn't a question. Josie shook her head once. He gave a single nod. "I figured, but I wanted to say thanks." She tilted her head slightly, "For patching my coat." He held up the edge, one sleeve mended with neat, careful stitches. She had sewn it without asking, left it on the saloon railing. Josie shrugged. "Most folks wouldn't have bothered," he said. Then he paused. "Name's Colt." The name settled in the air like thunder just beyond the hills. Colt McCade. She knew that name. Everyone did. He was the man they sent when the law failed. The bounty hunter who didn't flinch, who brought in corpses when they asked for prisoners. Stories followed him like ghosts. Some said he once shot a man from 100 yards with his eyes half closed. And now, he was here, talking to her. Josie nodded once, then walked inside. The next week he came every day. Sometimes they shared a drink, sometimes not. But there was a rhythm now, a quiet understanding that didn't need sound to survive. They played cards once, in the corner booth. Josie beat him twice, and he never accused her of cheating, just smirked and handed her his coins. She smiled that night, barely, but he saw it, and when he did, he smiled back like he'd struck gold. The town, though, was less amused. Whispers grew sharper, eyes narrowed when they sat too close. The sheriff spat every time Colt passed. Miss Adelaide, the preacher's wife, made a show of crossing the street when Josie walked by. "She's cursed him," someone muttered. "She'll bring him down like she did the last one," said another. They didn't say it to her face, but Josie felt it. Every step, every glance. Dry Creek didn't like what it couldn't control. And a gunslinger sitting with the town's ghost. That was enough to make the ground tremble. One night, as Colt helped her shutter the saloon windows, he spoke low. "You feel it too?" Josie nodded, They're scared. She pointed to herself, then to him, then back to the street. He smiled without humor. Yeah, a man with a past and a woman with none. Makes 'em nervous. She touched her throat, her old scar, then made a slicing, motion with her hand. No, he said gently. You ain't the broken one here. She stared at him a long time, then reached into her pocket and handed him something folded, an old yellowed page torn from a church hymnal. She'd written on the back, "Why are you here, really?" He read it twice, then folded it again, careful. "Same reason you are," he said. "To disappear." He turned to go but stopped at the door. "You ever need me, you just look up. I'll know." Then he was gone. The next morning, Josie found a bullet lodged in her doorframe, no note, just the cold weight of warning. Trouble was coming. It started with a stranger at the edge of town, a man with a gray hat and a black glove. He didn't speak, just stared from the shadows while Josie fetched water. Then another. This one with a crooked tooth and a scar down his eye. She saw him outside the apothecary, carving something into the wood. 3 notches, 3 days. Colt didn't show that night, or the next. On the 3rd, Josie waited. The saloon was quiet, too quiet. Even the piano was still. The bartender left early. The sky turned the color of bruised peaches. Then the men came, 3 of them. Dusty, mean, and smiling like wolves. "You Josie Miles?" the tallest asked. She didn't answer. "I heard you killed a man once. Buried him nice too. Might need you to dig a couple more." They stepped forward. One held a rope. She backed into the bar, reached under the counter. Empty. The bartender had taken the shotgun. She turned, heart pounding, no knife, no escape. Then, bang. The front door burst open, and Colt McCade stood there, revolver drawn, coat billowing like smoke. "Step away from her," he growled. The tallest man chuckled. "You aiming to die for her, McCade?" Colt didn't blink. "Already died once. Don't scare me none." The room tensed like a coiled spring. Then, 3 shots. Fast. Precise. When the dust cleared, the 3 men were on the floor. 1 groaning, 2 not moving at all. Josie didn't breathe. Colt turned to her, holstered his gun, walked forward slow. He touched her cheek, gently. "I told you. You ever needed me." She reached up, took his hand. For the first time in years, she let someone hold her. The wind outside howled through the broken door, and Dry Creek would never be the same again. They burned her room, not the whole building, just hers. The attic above the blacksmith shop where the roof leaked and she'd stitched her quiet life together piece by piece. It happened sometime near midnight. No one saw who did it. No one offered help. The townsfolk watched the smoke rise, arms folded and lips tight. Josie stood across the street, barefoot in her nightdress, watching her few possessions crackle and curl into ash. Her hands trembled, but her face didn't change. She didn't cry. Not then. Not there. The sheriff showed up late, as always. Took one look at the charred frame and spat in the dirt. "Guess Dry Creek's finally getting tired of ghosts." Colt arrived just as they were walking away. She didn't look at him, just stood staring at the smoking rubble. He said nothing. Took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. She didn't shrug it off. Only then, when the crowd was gone and silence returned to the street, did she move. Not toward him. Away. Josie walked, out past the edge of town, beyond the fences and the barbed wire and the dead cornfields, into the hills where the wind cut sharper and the moon burned cold. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to leave. It was past midnight when the clouds rolled in. The first flakes came light and soft, then thicker, heavier. Snow in May was rare in Dry Creek. But tonight, it came down hard, erasing every hoofprint, every footprint, every path she thought she knew. Josie's legs gave out on the edge of a ravine. She collapsed to her knees, chest heaving. Her throat ached from the cold. Her hands, raw and bloodied from brambles, clutched the last thing she had. A scrap of scorched cloth from her burnt pillowcase. She held it like a lifeline, like a memory she refused to let go of. It wasn't the flames that broke her. It was that no one stopped them. Not one person in town had tried. Except him. And maybe that's why it hurt more, because she'd almost believed it, that she could belong, that someone could see her and not just the shadow of her past. And when the flames rose, so did the truth. Dry Creek would never let her live in peace. Colt found her just before dawn. He didn't ride in shouting her name, didn't draw his gun or curse the sky. He dismounted in silence, footsteps crunching through the snow, and knelt beside her like he'd known exactly where she'd be all along. She didn't flinch. He sat down beside her, not touching, not asking. They sat like that for a long time. Finally, he pulled something from his coat pocket. A small bent tin cup, poured from a flask and offered it to her. Just enough warmth to sting her lips. She took it. He looked at her, not pitiful, not scared. Just real. I came back to Dry Creek because I thought I could outrun what I was, he said. Turns out the past faster than a bullet. She looked down. You don't have to talk, he added, but you need to hear this. She met his eyes. I've killed men who begged for mercy and let others go who deserved worse. I've done things I ain't proud of, but I ain't never turned my back on someone who didn't deserve it. He looked away for a moment, then back. You didn't deserve this. A single tear rolled down her cheek, hot against the frozen wind. She didn't wipe it away. He offered his hand. Just open. No pressure. She stared at it. Then slowly, like the earth itself might split, she placed her fingers in his. Not to be saved, just held. They didn't return to town. Not right away. Colt led her to an old cabin tucked in the ridge beyond Dry Creek. It was barely more than 4 walls and a stove, but it had a roof and dry blankets. He chopped wood while she warmed her feet. Neither said much, but the silence no longer pressed against her chest. That night, as snow painted the windows white, Josie wrote something on a scrap of paper. I was 17. My husband hit me. Then the fire came. She handed it to him. Waited. Colt didn't look shocked, just nodded. Men like that ain't worth the ground they rot in, he said. She wrote again. They say I killed him. He stared at her words. Did you? A long pause, then she shook her head, but her eyes said more. She wanted to, and she'd always wondered if maybe she should have. He reached for the pencil. You didn't have to. She smiled then. A real one. Tiny, but true. They stayed in that cabin 3 days. No clocks, no lawmen, no whispers, just 2 broken souls learning how to breathe again. On the 4th day, she looked out the window, toward Dry Creek. Then she nodded. It was time to go back. They returned just after dawn. Riding, side by side, no one said a word as they passed. The townsfolk stood frozen, watching, waiting. But there were no flames, no bullets, only wind and footsteps. At the saloon, Josie stepped down from the saddle, back straight. She walked inside. Behind the bar, she placed a sign. Open at noon. Then she began to sweep the floor. Like nothing had changed, but everything had. And when the sheriff came later that day, badge crooked, eyes narrowed, Colt stepped between him and the door. She's not leaving, he said. The sheriff's jaw clenched. You can't protect her forever, McCade. Colt leaned forward, voice low. I ain't here to protect her. Then he looked over his shoulder, at the woman sweeping broken glass like it was just another Tuesday. I'm here to stand with her. They built the fence in silence. Post by post, rail by rail. Sun rising over the red dirt as sweat glistened on Colt's neck and Josie's hands blistered raw. It wasn't much of a ranch yet, but it was theirs. 5 acres just beyond the south ridge. Wild grass, thorn bushes, and a creak that whispered promises in the dark. They started with a barn, then a chicken coop, then 4 horses, 2 pigs, and a rusted weather vane that squealed every time the wind shifted. Colt taught her to saddle a Mustang. Josie showed him how to make biscuits that didn't taste like gravel. At night they sat by the fire and said nothing, yet every quiet minute between them filled what silence once stole. He carved wood. She stitched. They made a bed frame together, knotted pine, smoothed at the edges. On the headboard, Colt carved a single word. Still alive, still here, still them. The town kept its distance. The sheriff stopped coming around. Miss Adelaide crossed the street again, but now it was out of fear, not judgment. And some nights, someone left a jar of preserves or a sack of beans at their gate. Silent apologies from those who'd once turned their backs. Josie still didn't speak, but she laughed now, soft, quick, like the sound of wind through tall grass. And when she did, Colt froze every time, like he was afraid the moment would vanish if he breathed too loud. But peace doesn't come cheap in the West, and fire, once it touches your life, always finds its way back. It started with a letter. Folded crisp, stamped with a seal. Josie didn't recognize, but Colt did. His hands trembled when he opened it. She watched him read it 3 times, then watched the color drain from his face. He looked at her, eyes tired. U.S. Marshal's got a warrant, he said. Says I'm wanted in Wyoming. Old job I never finished. Josie stepped forward. He shook his head. Was a bounty, a man named Harlan Vex. I let him live. Turns out he didn't return the favor. She gestured. What now? I gotta go, he said. Set things right. She grabbed his arm, shook her head violently. I can't let this hang over us, he said softly. He'll come for me. Or worse, come for you. Then he looked down. But I won't go if you tell me not to. Josie froze. For the first time since they met, the choice was hers. Not survival. Not silence. Choice. She reached for her journal, hands shaking. Come back. Promise me. He took the pencil. I swear it. They made love that night like it might be the last time. Not rushed, not desperate, just slow, aching need. 2 souls who'd finally found home in each other, now asked to risk it all. At dawn, he rode out. She stood at the fence line, holding the rail he'd carved. Still, 3 weeks passed, the days blurred. Josie fixed the chicken wire, brushed the horses, wrote letters she never sent. At night, she sat by the fire, Colt's coat draped over her shoulders, his pistol resting by her boot. Just in case, the town stayed quiet until it didn't. It was dusk when the rider came, not Colt thin, snake-eyed, dust on his boots and something cruel in his smile. Ma'am, he tipped his hat. Name's Vex. Colt say I'd be visitin'? She froze. He leaned on the fence post, fingers twitching. I figured I'd find the pretty one he kept talking about. Her hand slid to the pistol. Too slow. Vex had his drawn and cocked before she blinked. Now. No need for that. He stepped forward. He left you, didn't he, just like the rest? Ain't that the curse on you? She didn't flinch, but she did spit. Right at his boots. He laughed. Feisty. Maybe I'll keep you. Then he raised the gun. Crack, a shot rang out, clean, sharp, unmistakable. Vex dropped to his knees, clutching his shoulder, gun flying from his grip. Josie turned, and Colt McCade stood at the tree line, rifle raised, dusty, bruised, alive. Vex gasped. You said you wouldn't shoot me. Colt walked forward, slow and steady. I didn't promise you nothing. Then he looked to Josie. She was crying, silent, shaking sobs, the kind that only happen when fear finally breaks. Colt knelt in front of her, gun lowered. I came back, he whispered. I always will. She touched his face, lips trembling. Then, she reached into her coat pocket and handed him a folded piece of paper. He opened it. I'm ready to talk. Just one word. He blinked, looked up at her. and for the first time she said it aloud. Barely a whisper, raw with rust. Home. They buried Vex in the canyon. No prayers, no headstone, just dirt. They didn't speak of it again. Instead, they rebuilt the gate, planted apple trees. On the porch, Josie painted a sign, McCade Ranch. Visitors came now, not with torches, but with trade. A boy with a sick foal. A widow who needed eggs. A preacher who apologized without using words. And one evening, as the sun melted into gold and the wind smelled of lilacs, Colt took Josie's hand and dropped to one knee. No ring, no audience, just two hands calloused and tired. "I ain't asking for forever," he said. "Just the rest of your days." She smiled, nodded, then whispered again. "Yes." The bell above the saloon door rang once. Josie stepped inside, dust, clinging to her boots, eyes calm as still water. Heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the poker cards stopped shuffling. It had been nearly a year since she'd last stood in that room, a year since they whispered murderous, witch, and bad luck behind half-empty glasses. But now she wore blue, sky-colored, fabric stitched by her own hands, and her hair was braided with sprigs of white sage. She didn't flinch, didn't bow her head. Colt walked in behind her, dusty, tall. Shadow still stretched long across the floor like it always had, but this time his hand was in hers. The sheriff stood up from his stool. "This ain't your place anymore," he grunted. Colt nodded. "Ain't looking to take it back." Then he glanced across the room, at every man and woman who'd once turned their backs on Josie. "I just got something to say." He looked at her. She nodded, giving him permission this time. Colt turned to the room, voice steady. "This here's Josie McCade." Gasps. He went on. "She's my wife. She's the one who fixed my hands when I forgot what peace felt like. She's the one who didn't run when the fire came back for her. Again." He paused. "She ain't cursed. She survived more than most of you could dream. And I won't let this town pretend it didn't try to bury her before it ever knew her name." The silence that followed was different this time. No hate, no heat, just guilt, recognition. The sheriff said nothing, just tipped his hat and walked out the door. One by one, others followed, until the saloon was empty, except for the two of them. That night, under a sky split wide open with stars, they said their vows. No preacher, no choir, just dry grass, candlelight, and the sound of a fiddle playing from somewhere in the hills. Josie held a bundle of prairie flowers. Colt wore his cleanest shirt. A young boy from town brought a silver band carved from the barrel of an old rifle. And when she looked into Colt's eyes, she didn't see the gunslinger. She saw the man who had knelt beside her in the snow, the man who stood when no one else did. They didn't speak their vows, they wrote them, one line each burned into wood, then placed it above their bed. It read, "Still, always." Years passed. The McCade Ranch grew, horses, cattle, even a few dogs who refused to leave. The town softened too. A new sheriff came to power, younger, kinder. A schoolhouse opened down the road. Josie started teaching girls how to write in the margins of their own stories, and in early spring, when the wildflowers began to bloom again, they welcomed a daughter. Her name was Eliza May, named after the mother Josie never got to know. Colt built her a crib with the same hands that once broke bones and drew steel. Josie sang lullabies she'd never heard before, melodies that came from deep in her chest, like they'd been waiting their whole life to be sung. On the coldest night that year, snow came again. Josie stood at the fence line, Eliza bundled in her arms. Colt joined her, silent, steady. He reached for her free hand, fingers wrapping, tight. No words, just warmth. She leaned into him. Together, they watched the snow fall across the field, the same field she once collapsed in alone, but not anymore, never again. She was never a curse. She was someone's miracle all along. Subscribe, and let me introduce you to the next miracle tomorrow.